Hey there, Crumb Bums. It's time for yet another supplemental series to Canonically Crumb. So now you can watch Canonically Crumb, where I explore the comics and characters of the Crummy-verse. You can tune in to Canonically Crumb News, your #1 source for fast-breaking Crummy-verse news. And you can do lists with Canonically Crumb Lists. That one doesn't really have a slogan. But in this show, we're looking at the books and physical media that delivers the Crummy-verse to our hungry, hungry eyeballs. It's Collectively Crumb, the show that exclusively explores the publications and collectibles of the Crummy-verse. Now, on most episodes of this show, I think we'll be looking at one specific Crumb thing and its contents. You know, sort of a consumer report video. But to start the series off, our very first episode will be an overview of my entire R.Crumb collection. Or at least what it looks like today, 20 years after it began, which is where I want to start, with the first bit of crumb I ever got my grubby fingers on. And it might surprise you. Oh, by the way, sorry for the video quality on this one. My setup is not ideal. This is my well-worn copy of Cosmic Retribution, The Infernal Art of Joe Coleman, published by Fantagraphics in 1992. This is the second edition from 1994. You can see the spine is detached, and it basically got destroyed in a flood. I dried it out page by page almost 30 years ago. But inside, the introduction is handwritten by none other than R.Crumb. At the time, I had no idea who he was, but a year or two later, I would see the animated Fritz the Cat cartoon and the Zwigoff documentary, and I was pretty much hooked after that. So, this is the first piece of my collection, technically. But before I go on, I just want to talk about the nature of my Crumb collection. You see, I don't collect precious objects. I collect books to read and to look at. So, I actually tend to shy away from floppies and first editions because you have to be so delicate with them. I find bags and boards inconvenient and cumbersome when I want to look at something, and I often ruin the cover with the little tape. I only really keep floppies if I can't get the content conveniently in a book form. And I mean, this is how I keep them. Terrible for preservation purposes, but, you know, ease of access is my priority. My other priority is space. Anyone who collects books knows that the struggle to find a place to keep it all is real. So I want to avoid overlap as much as I can, and the goal is to collect as complete a representation of Crumb's work as possible in as few books as possible. And to that end, let's start with the canon as I've defined it in every episode of Canonically Crumb. So first up, we have the Yum Yum book, sometimes called the Big Yum Yum book. It's the story of Augie and the Beanstalk, which is actually owned by the estate of the late Dana Crumb, Robert's first wife, which is why it doesn't appear in the complete Crumb series. Now, I know I just finished saying that I don't care about first editions, but this one actually does happen to be a first edition from Scrimshaw Press. It was published in 1975, but the artwork was drawn in 1963. I also have it in French. I bought this years ago by mistake, and for a long time I wouldn't let myself buy a new copy, you know, as like a punishment. But I got a good deal on this one, so I'd actually recommend a first edition if you're looking to buy this, because the cost of these were basically the same. Next up we have The Complete Crumb, published by Fantagraphics between 1987 and 2005. I have all 17 volumes. A couple are hardcover editions. Volume 7 here is the first one that I got, back in 2006, I think? I got it for Christmas. And the rest I picked up here and there, until I finally had them all in 2019. You know, and it wasn't easy. I ended up with a few doubles because it was cheaper to buy some in lots of like 3 instead of just buy the 2 that I wanted. You know, I'm in Canada, so shipping is really expensive and you have to factor that in. Volume 11 was by far the hardest to get, and frankly it's a crime what I paid for this. Highway Robbery. But this series is fantastic. It has almost everything, minus his sketchbook work, up to Hup. But not everything. For example, I had to pick up this single issue of San Francisco comic book because it had a 3-page Gloria Nord comic that I originally saw in the Bible of Filth, which I don't have a copy of. Honestly, I wish it was in the Complete Crumb. I would love to see like 3 more volumes covering all the stuff that we'll be looking at in a minute. But, you know, that probably won't happen. Next up, we have the Weirdo Years. A lot of people would say that this is the best book of Crumb's work that you can get, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree. There's no better collection of Crumb's most developed artwork, but there's something squinky.
Squinky is the word.
About that late 60s, early 70s Crumb. You know, I think you need that. Published by Last Gasp in 2013, it collects most of Crumb's contributions to Weirdo, including all of the covers. Though some of these I have 4 or 5 goddamn times in my collection now. And I think that's got to be a future Canonically Crumb list episode. The most reprinted Crumb. But it is missing things like the letters pages, ads, and some of the photo comics. I also have The Book of Weirdo, which has got to be the definitive book on the subject of Weirdo. There's interviews and all kinds of information on every Weirdo artist. And while these books aren't officially a series, they kind of are by design. And so I think these books together also beg for some more volumes, collecting the work of other artists in Weirdo, and maybe a small volume with the missing Crumb stuff I mentioned earlier. But, you know, they'd just team up with Taschen or something and print a massive box set that included all of the Crumb stuff again, and it would cost like $8,000. No, thank you. Then we have Zap. Most of Crumb's Zap contributions are in the Complete Crumb, but there are 4 issues of Zap that came out after the period that the Complete Crumb covers, so I have those. I did an episode about number 14 called Rashomon at Terry Zwigoff's, so check that out. I don't have the complete Zap because it's one of those super expensive box sets, and I have all of the Crumb work from it already. I also have this copy of Zap number 7, because a friend gave it to me, and I keep it for the contributions by other artists. Which is also why I have these 2 books, Underground Classics and the Apex Treasury of Underground Comics. Next up in the canon, we have Hup, and I think some of this material hasn't been reprinted yet, or it hasn't at least been reprinted all together, and so I have all 4 of these in floppy form. They were published by Last Gasp in the late 80s and early 90s, and this series is really defined by the return of Mr. Natural and the introduction of Devil Girl. All of her canonical comic appearances are in Hup, but I picked up this German museum catalog because there's an unpublished Devil Girl page in it. It's in English, so it's no big deal. Plus it has this unpublished Bécassine parody comic. Then I have all 3 volumes of Mystic Funnies. Number 3 was the first actual Crumb comic that I owned. I bought it in 2002 when it came out. I was, 19 or 20. You can see I lent it to my friend Sarah, and she gave it back to me with the cover off. So, I taped it back on. This is definitely the weakest of the trilogy. It's still really good, but Mystic Funnies 1 and 2 are these phenomenal full-length stories by Crumb, and they feel really inspired in a way that number 3 just isn't. To my knowledge, Mystic Funnies hasn't been reprinted in its entirety anywhere. And the final part of the Crummy-verse canon, as defined by me, is a little bit of dirty laundry. Now, I've explained before that, for convenience, I call all of Robert and Aileen's collaborative comics Dirty Laundry, even though they have different titles. For example, here's a couple issues of Self-Loathing Comics, which is the same shtick as Dirty Laundry. Admittedly, this is the most incomplete part of my collection. There's a book called Drawn Together, which I don't have, and it collects all of their collaborative stuff up until 2012. But I have so much of what's in there here, and in the Complete Crumb, as well as other books that we'll see. And so I just haven't justified buying it yet. Also, there's dirty laundry stuff that came out after that book was published, including the outrageously overpriced art zine, Ça Vaut Peu, from last year. So my hope is that, in light of Aileen's recent passing, maybe Drawn Together will get reprinted with that extra stuff in there, or something like that. So that's the canon. I also have the Book of Genesis, which I don't count as canon because, as Crumb says, he treated it as a straight illustration job. But if you like religious imagery and myth like I do, then it's a must-have. I've read it cover to cover like 4 or 5 times now. Speaking of illustration jobs, I have this primer on Kafka, which is quite good. It's also available in a variety of editions, all of which are nicer than this one. This is the complete record cover collection, but not so complete that it includes the dozen years of album art that he's done since it was published in 2011. So looking forward to a second volume. I have all 3 issues of Art and Beauty magazine, published first by Kitchen Sink in 1996, and most recently in 2016 by Fantagraphics. These are all naturalistic drawings from photos, with some commentary and inspirational quotes about art and, well, beauty. There's a single book that collects all 3 volumes, but it was significantly cheaper to buy them like this. So that's where I'm at. Rounding out the non-canonical works, I have Peter Bagg's Other Stuff, which has this Cathy spoof called Caffy, a comic that he collaborated with Crumb on for his book Neat Stuff in the 1980s. There's this American Splendor graphic novel, Our Movie Year, which features Crumb on a couple of pages. And I have this Big Mouth comic book with a comic called Dad, written by Crumb and illustrated by Pat Moriarty. I actually covered this comic a little bit in Canonically Crumb number 7, White Man, Part 1, a story of civilization in crisis. I also have the complete Crumb comic covers from the French publisher Cornelius Editions from 2021. This has some alternative covers and, covers for things that were never published, as well as covers to books where I have everything inside the books except for the covers. So like this book of Mr. Natural is now pretty much obsolete in my collection. And finally, I have Odds and Ends, which I had naively hoped was sort of designed to fill in some of the gaps of the complete Crumb, but it's mostly commercial spot illustrations and random stuff, a lot of which is published elsewhere. What's nice is that it's laid out chronologically, and so you can kind of flip through and get a quick snapshot of where Crumb was commercially in any given year. But wait, there's more. I have all 6 volumes of Taschen's R.Crumb sketchbook series. They did a 12-volume box set version first, which, would have been nice, but it was prohibitively expensive. I have the dust jackets for all 6, but, I find they just get in the way. Number 6 ends in 2011, so presumably there's at least another volume worth of sketchbook stuff out there, and hopefully that comes out in the future at some point. These were all really easy to get when I started collecting them about 1.5 years ago. All except for volume 4, that is, which I bought 9 times from 5 different countries before I finally managed to get my hands on a copy, and for a lot more than cover price. We'll leave it at that. They're all really nice, though volume 2 has a few off-register pages. They pair really well with the canonical works, and you can really glean some insight into his process reading these. Also, in terms of sketch stuff, I have a handful of issues of the zine Mineshaft, which have some more recent sketch stuff, although some of it is already in here. Same with this copy of Id number 1, which is all just sketchbook stuff. I have 2 of the 4 volumes of Waiting for Food, which collect his placemat doodles from restaurants. These are pretty easy to come by, so I'm not in a major rush to grab the other 2 just yet. And finally, I have a copy of the ridiculously large anthology Kramer's Ergot number 10, which has this rough, tough cream puff sketchbook comic from the 90s, which I don't think is in any of the other sketchbook volumes. But, you know, it also has a lot of other great artists, so, you know, it's nice to have around anyway. But you can't just read Crumb. You gotta read about Crumb. Which is why I have the R.Crumb coffee table art book. This is a softcover edition, which I bought for these great handwritten chapter intros, as well as for the fact that it reprints some of Charles Crumb's Fuzzy the Bunny childhood artwork, which I hope to make an episode of soon. Then I have the R.Crumb handbook from 2005, and this is probably the single best primer on Crumb out there. It has some great information and some random stuff that you wouldn't see anywhere else, like these pistachio shells that he drew on, or these tattoo designs. Oh, and it comes with a CD sampler of Crumb's music, and also a bookmark. But I misplaced that in one of these books back here. Both the handbook and the coffee table book were assembled by Crumb's personal friend and Zorro enthusiast, Peter Poplansky. I also have the R.Crumb Dream Journal, which sadly isn't handwritten and doesn't really have any original art in it. What it does have at the beginning, though, is an invaluable list of Crumb's friends, family, and associates from throughout his life, with little descriptions about each. Then, I have the amazingly titled Your Vigor for Life Appalls Me, which sadly doesn't include many letters that really blew my mind or anything, like, you know, really personal letters to Charles or something like that. This is The Life and Times of R.Crumb, which is just basically a collection of statements about Crumb by other artists. And there's quite a few of them, actually, from a bunch of different fields, and so, you know, it is kind of interesting. And of course, I have the Crumb Compendium, which is supposedly the definitive R.Crumb bibliography. There are at least two others that I know of, but I don't have either of them. The more famous one being the R.Crumb checklist from the early 80s. Carl Richter did a really good job on this, and it's well laid out, and I use it all the time. Plus it has some fun art throughout. I just recently picked up these two collections of interviews. R.Crumb Conversations is a collection of interviews from 1968 to 2002, and the subject index makes it really useful. And the Comics Journal Library R.Crumb Collection, which compiles 5 different interviews from the Comics Journal. But there's still more, because the whole family is crazy, don't you know? This is Crumb Family Comics, which was put together largely by Maxon Crumb, ostensibly as a companion piece to the Terry Zwigoff documentary Crumb from 1994, but it didn't come out until 1998. And this is the juicy family gossip right here. It has work from Robert, Maxon, Charles, Aileen, Jesse, and Sophie, with a particular focus on the stuff that's related to the film. It also reprints some of Charles' very personal letters, and it reprints an entire issue of Dirty Laundry Comics. Speaking of the Crumb family, I also have Maxon's illustrated biography from 2018 called Maxon, Art Out of Chaos. Very disappointing. You know, you want to hear more about his relationship with Charles and his sex offense charge, you know, but the whole thing feels very smoothed out. I've come pretty close to buying his weird sadosexual incest novel, Hardcore Mother, a few times, but to be honest, I find his writing needlessly obfuscating and cocky, and, you know, I don't really enjoy reading it. I have a fair bit of Sophie Crumb's work as well. These 2 issues of Belly Button Comics are from 2002, which were really good for her age, and it's really a shame that she didn't do much more in the way of comics. I also have this comics journal with an extensive interview with her from around the same time. And this book, Evolution of a Crazy Artist, which I think is a little ambitious, given that she, you know, doesn't seem to be publishing much these days. But, you know, it's useful if just to see how kids develop artistically. It slipped my mind when I was recording that I do have the complete women's comics, which features quite a few contributions from Aileen Kaminsky-Crumb. I do still need to get a copy of Aileen's illustrated autobiography, Love That Bunch, as well, but it's available for lending on the archive, so I'm not in a huge rush. Oh, and I forgot all about Harvey Kurtzman's Strange Adventures, which features Ode to Harvey Kurtzman, which I have reprinted multiple times in my collection now, and which was the subject of the most recent Canonically Crumb episode. So check that out too. I have a couple things that are still en route, like these Foo facsimiles, and this Charles Crumb sketchbook sampler. And of course there are several other books which I haven't mentioned that I'd still like to get my hands on, to sort of round out the collection. And there's always some obscure exhibition or auction catalog that turns up with something that I'm missing. Collecting Crumb is like peeling an onion. There's always another layer underneath. But I think that's all for today, Crumb Bums. Leave a comment if there's a book you see here that you'd like me to talk about in depth in a future episode of Collectively Crumb. Or if you see any unmentioned or glaring omissions from my collection, please tell me about those as well. And if you enjoy this program, please hit like, hit subscribe, be a ding-dong daddy, and ding that bell. I've been your host, Kyle Bridget. You can find my links in the show description, and also check out my podcast, PODRZEBIE, the comic book nerdcast that dares to ask, what, me worry? And if you want to support this program and myself, you'll find my Patreon and donation links in the show description as well. Canonically Crumb will be back as weekly as possible with another deep dive into the Crummy-verse. Thanks again, Crumb Bums, and keep on the scene.
Everybody's selling it, yeah. Everybody's buying it. Yes, you can't get enough of that stuff. Some like it weak, some like it strong. Right or wrong, some you get, you wish you never had. Some is so good, some is so bad. The more you get, the more you want. You can't get enough of that stuff. I mean, you can't get enough of that stuff.